Welcome back to Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. We're talking to Miko Peled. Miko was a son of a very prominent Israeli general, who, after fighting in the 1948 war, came out after the 1967 war calling for compromise with the Palestinians. Miko grew up as an outcast along with his father and family, social outcast that is, as a result of his father's opinions. But Miko, you grew up, you go to high school, and do you go to university? This continues, this issue of your father's prominence, and when does your father pass away? When we're leading up here to you joining the military.
Yeah, well, I joined the military in 1980, like all Israel, just right after high school, like all Israelis need to do, and many don't today, but you need to do. And the atmosphere in which I grew up was, of course, that you volunteer for special forces and you do your best. And there were two elements to that, to be honest. One element is kind of patriotic, but the other element is vanity, because you grew up looking at these special forces guys with their red berets and their semi-automatics.
Special forces women, they always have like models. Yeah. Women that look like models in special forces gear.
We didn't have, not in those days. This is a new phenomenon, this kind of semi-porn. But just an example, when I grew up, Netanyahu and his brother were in the military, and they were good friends of, they were good friends. And I would see Bibi come home, with his uniform, and he was like, he's an officer in one of these special forces units and so on. And that image was so powerful, So a lot of us young guys, that was our model. That's what we wanted to be like. We didn't know about the politics.
But you grew up in a very political household.
Yeah.
Your father's outspoken. You've been called, an Arab lover and all of this.
Right.
And he critiques, I would assume, as part of this critique of Israeli policy, the role of the Israeli military. No.
Yeah.
So. Is there does he encourage you to join? Does he discourage you? I mean, it seems a little contradictory.
Yes, it does seem contradictory. The way it's portrayed is this liberal brand of Zionism says, this is our land, this is our right, we must have a strong military to protect it. We may have to make sure that we don't do things that are immoral. We need to maintain a moral army. We do maintain a moral army. From time to time, there might be accidents or things that are wrong, but basically we maintain the moral high ground. And as a good soldier, that's what you do. You go in, you do your best, and of course you make sure from the inside that you do the right thing when it's when it's up to you. But there was absolutely no discussion on whether or not I should serve at any point, at any time. Not at all. This was obvious. It was a given. In fact, we look forward to it. Me and my friends, we look forward to, that moment. You come home in uniform and you carry that semi-automatic, because Israeli soldiers take their weapon home. There's a prestige that comes with this. And like I said, much of it is vanity. Not all of it is patriotism, although it's painted with patriotism. So that's what I do. I volunteer, I go through basic training, I do all this stuff. And I'm in this particular unit for a whole year. And as I'm being trained, I go through several experiences which I just don't understand. I talk about this in the book. The chapter in the book talks about it's called the Red Beret. I remember, we used to march at night. Marches were always at night, very long marches, night-long marches. And we were walking through fields with crops, and we're trampling these crops. Now we're in the West Bank, so these are Palestinian fields. Many of the big Israeli army bases were in the West Bank at the time. And I run up to the sergeant and I say, "Look, must be some mistake here, because we're trampling these, somebody's crops." Of course, he says, "Shut up and keep marching." You don't talk to your sergeant when you're, in training. So off we go. That's what we do. And then another experience later on, we're patrolling cities in the West Bank, and we're taken by bus to the outskirts of, I believe it was Ramallah. And we have our officer, our lieutenant, gives us some orders, and we're given batons and these plastic handcuffs. And I'm going, we're not cops. Why are we being given batons and handcuffs? We're infantry soldiers. We're commandos. And then one of the things our lieutenant says is, you were walking up and down, you're marching up the streets. Anybody so much as looks at you, you break every bone in their body. Now, we're a fully armed, top to bottom unit of infantry soldiers. We're going to be marching up and down a city. Everyone's going to be looking at us. How is anybody not going to be looking at us? It's such a weird thing, right? It's a weird sight. What are we supposed to do? We're really supposed to beat everybody up and break their bones? I mean, how does this order even make sense? What does it mean? You know, and there's no time to think, because you're given the order and then and off you go, and you're on the bus and off you go, and then you're given orders and you march up and down, and I mean, everything is very fast. There's no room for discussion or thinking, you know, and when you're a soldier, your lieutenant is like, you know, is God. You know, but little by little, I was seeing these things. Then a year into my service, I had to...
Can I just ask you a question?
Please.
I interviewed one of the Vets for Peace, American, and he talked about boot camp and the extent to which, before being sent to Iraq in boot camp, they were being prepared to be willing to shoot women and children, in the sense that one of the things he told me is, you have an experiment, or a mental experiment. You have to imagine you're in a market and someone's trying to shoot at you, and if you're to shoot back, you might have to kill women and children. Will you do it or not? And if your answer is no, then you haven't passed. The amount of the training to be brutal, how much was that part of your training?
I never went through anything like that. The way Israel does it is much more subtle. So we grew up, my generation particularly, on the myth of the heroism of 1948 and the morality of our guys. At the same time, we learn stories about massacres and terrible things that have happened. And the message is given in a much more subtle and roundabout way. So for example, there was a story of 35 soldiers who went, a unit that went to, on its way to some battle. And on their way, they saw a woman and a child. And they didn't harm them, even though they were Arabs. And later on, it turned out that that woman ran and warned the people in the village that they were coming, and they were all killed. Now you conclude what you conclude, you understand what you understand from this. You see, nothing has to be told. You don't have to be told that you should have shot them. The story is evident, and these 35 are, you know, considered great heroes. Everybody talks about them. You know, there's a kibbutz actually named after them. So those are the kinds of stories that we learn growing up, so then you don't need to be told the rest of it.
So
you know?
You're ordered, if someone looks at you, and I suppose looked at you sideways or something.
I guess.
Did you or any of the soldiers with you, did you break some bones?
No, we marched up and down. I mean, nothing was going on. This is you know, late 1980. I mean, everything was quite peaceful, really. On the face, at least on the surface, everything was quite peaceful. So there was no reason to do anything, and we never did anything. But then a year into it, I had knee surgery, and that's when I was sent to become a medic, fully intending to return to my unit, to my team as a medic. But the medic course was about 3.5 months long. And while I was going through that course, I had time to reflect on all the things that I had experienced. And this whole image of the fighter, the warrior, the red beret that I had already had, and what it meant and where it was going, and how, putting things in context of the occupation in 1967. And it was clear to me that I'm not going back there. There's no way that I can do this. The moral high ground that I thought we maintained was a bluff.
Was there a specific incident or thing?
No, it was just a gradual process where I realized, and the medical field, the medical corps is slightly more liberal. I met people who were more liberal anyway, who thought the way I used to think before I was in the military. It was kind of a coming home moment in a way, saying this is not who I am. This is not what I believe in. There were incursions already into Lebanon where Israeli commandos would go in and kill, and civilians were killed. So there was already a sense that something is just not right.
And how much role do you play? What happens with you during the Lebanon and the full-scale Lebanon invasion?
So what happened was I remained on that base as an instructor. I never went back to the unit. My unit, of course, had gone to Lebanon like all combat units did. I'm in this base as an instructor. And really the only thing that was different for us is that we taught shorter courses and much faster because the Army needed more medics. And then there was a sense of real betrayal because there was a moment where it was clear that the government was saying we're only going in for a 40-kilometer incursion while Israeli troops were already in Beirut. So it clearly was not a 40-kilometer incursion. Then there's Sabra and Shatila massacres. And my entire belief system, you know.
Just very quickly, for people that don't know, we've done several stories about these massacres, but this is a Palestinian village, essentially, that's slaughtered.
These are two Palestinian refugee camps, Sabra and Shatila, in southern part of Beirut, that Israel had didn't actually go in and do the killing, but they closed off they sealed the camps, and they gave support to the Phalangist Christians who were actually committing the massacres. So, and Israel was supporting these killers.
Did you know that at the time?
Well, there was an inquiry, and it was clear that Israel had. I mean, Israel was occupying, you know, Lebanon, so it was obvious that Israel had something to do with it. And the stories started coming out very, very quickly, and then there was an inquiry, and Ariel Sharon, who was defense minister, was found responsible, and so on. So, but it was very clear from the very beginning that this was something Israel was behind, even though they didn't do the actual killing. But the Israeli military was. What
was your father's attitude towards the Lebanese invasion and to your growing disillusionment? Because you start now getting more disillusioned at a kind of more fundamental level than perhaps he was.
Yeah. Well, he at the very first anti-war protest, he spoke. And he said, this is the first time in the history of the State of Israel that there is an anti-war protest while the war is going on. And he became a strong supporter of the soldiers who refused to go into Lebanon and support the refuser movement and so on. And of course, he was unique in that. Very few people supported that, certainly not, you know, former generals. And there was a sense, there was a huge break of trust and faith in the system and the military, you know, and it was clear that this was the true face of the State of Israel in many, many ways, although many, you know, hundreds of thousands came out to protest against Sharon and against the massacres. But it was very, very clear that this was, that the things that I had been taught, the things that I believed in, were lies. You know, that was and it wasn't just me. There was a whole generation of us that kind of went through that process.
So what happened next for you? You get your red beret.
Well, I already had my red beret and I gave it up. When I went back after my, or when I came at the end of my course, the course to become a medic, and I remained in that, on that base, the first thing I did was get rid of, you know, because the symbols that you earn are yours. So like you can wear the red beret even if you don't go back and serve as a, you know, whatever. But I said, I don't want any of the symbols. I don't want anybody to know. I have nothing to do with all of this. This has nothing to do with me. It's not who I am. And I don't care for these symbols. It's all vanity. And it is all vanity. So somebody else can have it. And then really I wasn't involved in anything. You know, I went overseas. I studied. I started a martial arts career. I did, you know, that was kind of my life was. And
you moved to the U.S.?
And I didn't get to the U.S. until, you know, several years later, intending to stay for a year or two. And then eventually I opened a business, I opened a karate school, and just started a life here. Pretty much disengaged from Israel, from Palestine, from the whole thing. And I talk about it in the book too, the moment where I decided which way my life was going to go, and I decided this was going to be my path, and that was it. Then, much later on, in 1997, suddenly I'm brought back into this, violently brought back into this. It was the mid-1990s. There was a lot of suicide bombings, a lot of violence going on. And my father had already passed away. He passed away immediately after Oslo. The Oslo Agreement was signed. And I go back to Jerusalem for the funeral. And it's a kind of horrifying experience that is really hard to describe in words. When you see this little coffin of a child going into the ground, and you see your sister, you know, the people you love, your family, just completely broken. You know, there's no way to describe it. It's so horrifying.
She was walking on the street. And
she was on the street with friends, and they were. That's it. They were killed. I mean,
she
they went
was
to
how
high
old?
schools. Yeah, she was 13. And this was a second or third in a series of some very violent suicide attacks. So anyway, so that was the reality. That's something that happened. And then when I describe this, in the book, when I arrived at my sister's apartment, this was 2 days later because I had to fly, it was packed with people who came to mourn, including Palestinians, because Palestinians who knew my father, came to express their heartfelt, sorrow and regret that this has taken place. And by the way, when I meet Palestinians everywhere, even today, Palestinians come up to me and express their sorrow at this. And then I felt, there was a sense that, something was wrong and something I had to discover. I had to understand something here. And then when I came back to the United States, I was looking for ways to get engaged, to talk to people, to find Palestinians, Israelis, anybody. And eventually I came across something that was taking place at the time, which were Jewish-Palestinian dialogue groups. This was in San Diego. And there were several of them around the country, and there was some news about them, about these, they were called living room dialogue groups, where Israelis that were Jews and Palestinians would meet and talk. And I became engaged. I started being, participating in one of these groups, and that was the first time I ever met Palestinians. Mm.
Around the time of the death of your niece, the reaction most people would expect is fury against Palestinians.
Yeah.
And but not only you, her family didn't react that way.
Well, yeah, the first thing my sister said was, when she was asked about retaliation and revenge and who was responsible, was, first of all, don't talk to me about retaliation, don't talk to me about killing more people. She said, no real mother would want this to happen to any other mother, this grief. And in terms of who's responsible, she said, well, who is it that's maintaining this brutal oppression and occupation of another people? Denying them water and food and travel and shooting their children in the schools as they're in their schoolyards and so on. We are maintaining this, and the Israeli government is responsible for all of these deaths, including my niece's death. That's what my sister said. And so that was the approach immediately that she took and her husband took, and kind of that was the approach that was taken, individually and collectively. And I think that has to do with the fact that we'd already been exposed to the fact that there was an injustice. We knew what was happening. Our father we'd been indoctrinated by him as to the reality of the Palestinians, although everything was within the West Bank and Gaza. Nothing was ever talked beyond that paradigm. The state of Israel is fine. There's a problem in the West Bank and Gaza. And it wasn't until I actually met Palestinians for the first time, and ironically, the first time I met Palestinians was not in Jerusalem, where I was born and raised, even though it's a mixed city, supposedly. It's in San Diego. It's here in the United States. And because of course, Jerusalem is a very segregated city. It's a very racist city. The entire country is actually segregated. And that's when I am exposed for the first time to this other narrative about 1948. What made the group that I was in unique is that 1948 was discussed. In many of the other groups, the Jews, and if there were any Israelis, then the Israelis made it clear that 1948 is not something we talk about.
Because that calls into question the very nature of the existence of the state.
The very legitimacy, exactly. And we can't, that's the Holy Grail. That's something that we hold above everything else. We can talk about everything past that, 1967 and so on. This particular group broke all the rules. And it just so happened that I was in that group, and everybody told their stories, and their stories came from 1948. The stories of their family, the stories of how they ended up in Kuwait, or how they ended up in a refugee camp, and how they ended up in the United States, and so on and so forth. So I'm sitting with these people who look nice, decent, friendly people, educated and everything, for the first time. They happen to be Palestinians. I feel a really strong connection to them. Many of them are from Jerusalem, like I was, yet they're telling me something that makes absolutely no sense. Because I come from a place that I know what happened in 1948 because my family experienced it. And they wouldn't lie to me, and the entire narrative that was taught to me, my family was part of, so what I know must be true. But these people are saying something that's completely the opposite. It makes absolutely no sense.
Well, you have to then start to question some of the core beliefs of your father.
Yeah, a little bit later, actually. That was the first step. Meeting the Palestinians was really the first introduction I had that there was another story. I didn't even know that there existed another narrative, that there existed another story to 1948, because we're never taught that. And then I start my own kind of investigation. Ilan Pape and some of the other Israeli historians who began writing about this, their books came out right around that time, questioning the entire story of 1948.
What year are we
narrative.
in now?
This is like 2000, 2001. And this stuff starts coming out. I actually called my brother. My older brother taught political science in Tel Aviv, and I said to him, I'm sitting with these Palestinians and they're telling me these stories, and it's not because they're anti-Semitic or they're terrorists or they're extremists. This is not the issue. And he said, well, you should go check out Ilan Pape and some of these other guys and what they've been writing, because that will give you a good idea of what these people are talking about. So that was kind of what I did. Then when I would go back home, I would venture into Palestinian towns. And that was the first time I ever drove into a Palestinian town. I'm talking about within what is considered Israel. In other words, Nazareth and Al-Fahim and all these towns that are predominantly Palestinian Arab, but they're within the boundaries, the safe boundaries of the state of Israel. They're all Israeli citizens. So they're kind of good Palestinians, safe Palestinians.
And you're allowed to go there. I mean, you're not even allowed to go to the West Bank. Right? It's weird. When I was there, if you have a foreign passport, you can go, but if you're Israeli, you're not supposed to go.
Yeah, you're not supposed to go, but we go, of course. And I'm beginning to experience the vast difference between the sphere where I grew up, which is clean and safe and Jewish and orderly, and this chaos, which is the Palestinian towns. You know, and of course, at first you don't understand, why is there such a difference? I mean, they're citizens, we're citizens. We always thought that they lived the same way that we did. You know, from time to time we'd get a glimpse and we'd wonder, why is it so backward here, you know? And of course we thought there was something wrong with them, which is really what the racist ideology teaches us, that the reason the people in the other is the way they are is because there's something wrong with them, not because they were deprived of, you know, our privilege. And then I start driving into the West Bank. Around 2005, I drove by myself the first time to the village of Bilain in the West Bank. Somebody told me that they had started this new non-violent popular resistance movement. That's when they began these Friday marches, these Friday protests. So I had rented a car with Israeli license plates, and I drove into the West Bank. And the whole way, once I got into the West Bank, you know, the roads with the potholes, and it's no more clean, and it's not this beautifully surfaced highways, and these Arab villages everywhere, and olive trees. Of course, all I saw was an Arab waiting around some corner wanting to kill me. And I'm driving through, you know, until I get to Bilain, and I thought, this is going to be my last day on earth. This is no way I'm coming back home. You know, they can identify me. I'm clearly an Israeli. I've got Israeli license plates. It's a rented car. I mean, you know, it's everything I was always told you should never do, you know.
And of course, nothing happened.
Well, not only nothing happened, many good things happened as a result of that.
I have to say, I had the exact same experience. In 2000, I rented a car and drove all the way through. I had stopped and had tea. Everyone couldn't have been more friendly.
Yeah. So many good things actually did happen as a result of that, and you know, I go back there all the time now. It's not even a question. Although the checkpoints are much tighter now. You know, they're not just kind of a bunch of soldiers and some rocks. It's like big terminals and all that kind of stuff. So the travel is a little more strict, is more difficult. But you know, the West Bank is very porous, and so it's not a problem. But that was when I began. I remember being in Bilain. It actually was that visit to Bilain, and then walking with some of the guys, and seeing the settlement that was being built on their land. And that's when it dawned on me, settlement is really not the word. These are big cities. Billions of dollars are invested here. This isn't going away ever. There's no way. This whole two-state solution nonsense, and they were talking about how there's this idea that maybe they would be one day compensated, they would be given land somewhere else, you know, trading land or all this nonsense. And I thought, this is absurd. They've built a huge city here, many of them. These are not little farms or little villages. We're talking about massive, massive construction and massive investment. This isn't going anywhere. This whole two-state solution is nonsense. And that was when I had the moment of clarity. I said, this is nonsense. The only way forward is complete equal rights in one democratic state, and it's not a Jewish state. It's a state of all of its people, and that's it. And that's the only way these guys are ever going to be compensated. It's the only way these guys are ever going to have any rights at all. And that's the end of it.
Okay, we're going to pick up this in the next segment of Reality Asserts Itself with Miko Peled on the Real News Network. Thanks for joining us.